Hello, everyone. We are here in the Universidad de las Américas having this interesting conversation named On the Possible, a post-extractivist planning perspective. We have super important guest today, and I will read something in order to make it very accurate. Chile and Australia share a general economic model, but not the same development strategy. Even so, both face critical challenges in terms of the long-term sustainability of these models. Additionally, their territories and their cities in particular reflect these processes in part with different nuances that allow for a comparative discussion of how an idea of future development can be addressed progressively from planning and urbanism. This conversation seeks to situate converging questions about these cases to produce ideas, scenarios, and critiques that open new perspective on these emerging problems. The conversation will include Professor Nick Phelps from the University of Melbourne, so I ask you to clap your hands. Professor Julie Miao from University of Melbourne as well. And Martín Arias Loyola from Universidad Católica del Norte. Thank you all for being here. I know that has been a long trip for all of you. So to start, a triggering question, Nick, how could you define urban planning?
Okay, thanks Francisco. Thanks everyone for being here. This is a trick question, isn't it? You're asking me to go back to my book and try and remember what I'd said in a book. So I'll try and paraphrase some of that. So available at all good bookstores, The Urban Planning Imagination. So I think in there is a definition somewhere very early on, maybe page 1, which goes something like urban planning is a historical stream of thoughts and practical actions towards making good or better places, and that also includes thinking about the processes that underlie that, the social, economic, and political processes that go towards the making of places. Those thoughts and practical actions, are carried in models, some of which were successful, implemented, others not. Ideals about what we're trying to aim for. There's a long history of having strong ideals about what the good city is, for example. Could be very sort of concrete actions as well that have been implemented. So a historical stream of thought and actions, and I took that idea really from C. Wright Mills's book, the Sociological Imagination, so trying to argue that there's something similar with planning. I'm going to give you more than one definition though, okay? So I'm going to give you a couple more. Some people have said that, if planning is everything, then it's nothing, okay? Because planning is quite hard to define, urban planning. Seems to encompass many, many different things. I mentioned things about placemaking, but also about processes, which are, not always observable, let's say, immediately so. But in my view, planning is pretty much everything. It is the sort of glue that binds us all together, or can be. And just to give you a very concrete example of that, so Julie, my colleague here, ran a student sort of studio session in Nanjing, where we've come from, and it included property students, architects, one urban planner, and they had to come up with an idea for regenerating a little district of Nanjing. So one group, the property-led group, came up with all kinds of wild, profit-led, profit maximization ideas for how you could generate revenue from this area. The architects obsessed about buildings and building designs, and somewhere in the middle, the team with the planner, which won the prize or the top presentation, came up with a more sensible mix of ideas, suggestions that involved a bit of each. And I'd like to think that the planner played this sort of moderating role of bringing people together. So the other staff member mentioned that the planner in the group did a really great job of sort of listening to the others and integrating the different insights into a more complete set of proposals, let's say. So there you are.
Of course,
can I jump in? That team won because they were supervised by a real estate expert, which was me. So my question I think I want to pose back to Nick is, what do you see the relationship between planning? You said planning is a glue, put everything together, but property people will say, we are the one realize, materialize all the planning idea. Then you have architects, designers would argue, we come up with more creative idea, whereas planning is all about regulation. So I wonder what's your thought there?
Thank you, my dear colleague Julie, for that provocation. Okay, that's the tone of the evening. No, it's a fair point. I mean, property people will say that they come with the money, they're taking the risk, and there is an argument to be said that when you do that, you do come with an imagination, and there is an argument to be said, that planning has become quite regulatory, quite negative, holding back people's visions. Okay, but come back to that presentation. The property students left to their own devices, I think would have come up with a set of proposals that would have completely failed, would have not only failed on their own terms, in other words, failed to generate a profit on behalf of the investors, which is pretty, that's pretty fundamental in property terms, but I think failed the neighbourhood, the people that lived there, really wouldn't have been balanced at all. So look, I mean, I think all of those groups do bring imagination, or can do, to the party. And maybe we'll come on to that, but I think we do need all the groups. I just think that planning, when it's at its best, and you've got skilled people, skilled listeners, interlocutors, can bring those different actors together and find the sort of shared interests. I probably shouldn't quote Donald Trump at this point, but to make a deal or do the deal. But his idea of a deal is probably different from what a planner's idea of a good deal would be.
Yeah, well, fantastic. I think this engagement that you are having, I'm waiting for the Martín to pop up and start to make some noise in this conversation, which is very interesting. And so maybe you already advanced in this question, but how imagination in planning could be relevant in contexts like specifically, because you know both Chile and Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just sort of scribbling down a few thoughts before we came on air. There's a bit of a crisis of imagination outside of extractive economies. So we go back to my home country, Britain, often considered the home of many planning ideas. I would say there's a bit of a crisis of imagination there. And I think one of the key things that it revolves around is not that there isn't imagination, it's just that it's not licensed. We tend to have a very sort of narrow view of what urban planning is, that it's something done by professionals in the public sector, essentially local governments. But not only are trained planners now obviously in the private sector, but they're also in the third sector, NGOs. Just look at the growth of international organizations and things like the SDGs. A lot of planning is now both international and in the NGO sector. You've got citizens, who for sure have ideas about their neighborhood. They're probably the most familiar with it, and there's an argument for saying they are most intimately aware of what would work and what wouldn't work, but they do need a bit of guidance. So there are many actors. I think the real challenge in Chile and Australia, as with other countries actually, is first and foremost allowing alternatives to come forward. Okay, so another definition of planning is about the evaluation of alternatives. Ask yourself, how often do we see many alternatives presented to us, whether it's by the professional urban planners or just in general. If you went back to the 1960s in Britain, this is the sort of, I guess Britain was at that moment modern, or trying to be modern, and we had a whole plethora of plans coming forward for strategic population and economic growth, and many of the interesting ideas were actually coming from the private sector. So without totally writing off the private sector, developers or private corporations, this was a moment when private companies were sponsoring planning ideas, visions, okay, and there were some quite interesting ones. Some of the ones that would have best stood the test of time came from the private sector, not the public sector. It's not to say they were all good, because there were many floating around, but the key point was there were alternatives. There were futures being imagined at that point, and many of them. So I think, you know, one of the key starting points anywhere is to make sure there are enough plans, different plans, on display out there for us to begin to choose between or adjudicate about what their good and bad parts are. So that's a first step. I think it's really important in extractive economies because you put that general problem together of a lack of alternatives with probably what you could regard as a very fatalistic attitude surrounding the inevitability of underdevelopment around resource extraction. Whenever I've written academic journal papers, I've had comments back like, you know, why should we bother about mining towns? They're going to be gone. You know, don't worry about it. Why bother? But it's important to have those alternatives in that kind of context.
Sorry, I really had to jump in. Alternatives for what purpose? Because I was thinking about this mining context in China, where the private sectors keep coming up with illegal actions, try to circle around planning government policies. Then the new policy get in, try to fill the gap. Then another alternative, solution come up again, try to get the loopholes. I think there is a question about for what, isn't it, and by whom?
Yeah, definitely. Not all of those private sector imaginations in the 60s, for example, were particularly good ones. They weren't coming from a good place, let's say. I mean, I think General Motors, is it the Futurama kind of idea, was a thinly veiled sort of attempt to remake the city over in its own interest, the car being the product that they would be selling. So I can think of my own context in Britain. The best plan that I saw for planning strategic growth in the part of the country where I grew up, and there are about 4 or 5 plans on offer, was a plan that was funded by Alcan Corporation. So they probably had an interest in producing aluminium products for the building industry. However, they sponsored 2 quite famous graphic artists and town planners, Gordon Cullen, that might be a name that you're familiar with. That plan would have stood the test of time because it concentrated development into 2 historic cities, preserved land for a regional park. The other plans would have been much worse. So, yeah, of course it does matter. It matters that we have in mind good motivations. But I think when you have alternatives, you can start to sift and sort them out. Come back to the student presentations. We had 4 alternatives on display. And, it's pretty obvious which one was really, out on a limb in terms of being fairly capitalist, oriented. Let's make a lot of money, and a bit probably unrealistic in that as well. So there's definitely imagination there, but it's imagination for a very particular end, I think. I think the other thing, just to say, is that, we do have to be careful about groups in society who have a very limited interest. So corporations have a bottom line, they have a single goal, which is the bottom line, profit. Okay, companies can reduce their goals to a single one. Citizens sometimes do that. They can be very, very a force for very particular interests. Let's say they get very obsessed about one particular thing. So it is important as well that imagination is kind of inclusive, incorporates many interests, and I think that's where you get the better ideas.
I think you have provided a lot of challenging topics that we were addressing in the next questions, actually, because there's something about the pedagogical role of academia in this private-public relationship that is not yet discussed, and I think Martín has something to say about it. But let's leave it to produce a bit more of information about this discussion, which is very engaging. I mean, Julie, in Chile, we are facing a critical situation in relation to housing. How can urban planning foster innovative housing solutions beyond the neoliberal limitations?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I have to say I'm actually in real estate discipline, although I was trained as a planner. So I often face these difficult dilemmas. You know, you have planners blame developers, and developers say planners is evil force, like limited supply. So in my way of balancing my position, I think to this particular question as well, I would suggest three plausible approaches. First one is being a keen observer, taking ad hoc actions when there's like plausible alternative options on the table. The case came to my mind is a comparison between Pinkworks in Bristol and Baltic in Liverpool. I compared two cases and wrote quite extensively about them. So the Pinkwork one was a private-led urban regeneration scheme, and the developer himself was really creative and paid a lot of attention in providing housing, but also preserve the local culture and tradition. And I see there was a quite useful knowledge transfer from private to the public sector. The public sector, they take action and recognize this is actually plausible, and they are willing to adapt as well. Then going to the next step, I think it's more on the planning, on the regulation side. There's a lot of countries using inclusionary zoning, incentive zoning in order to encourage more affordable housing supply. But at the other end of the regulation, we could potentially think of loosen some of the strict planning regulations in order to encourage more creative solution from a private sector. So it's kind of play both ways. And the last one I want to emphasize is developers, planners can be a development partner, although the PPP model tends to attract quite a lot of critical voice as selling the city. But if the public sector is proactive and steering the way, it could set the standard and lift up the bar in terms of what could be the outcome. I think I will finish here.
I'll throw in a couple of fundamentals, and they might be a bit off to the side and a bit perhaps unrealistic, to a property developer. But one thing is, I think it's quite apparent in many developed nations that the state governments are really struggling with affordable housing. And I think there's a whole set of reasons for that. I mean, one issue is about land and who owns it. It's little remembered, really, that really the state needs to own sufficient tracts of land in order for, ultimately, for property, real estate to be affordable. Because if you own the land, you don't have to, if you don't wish to, you don't have to have it at highest and best use value. You can charge a lower rent, for example. So that's become quite a big issue, I think, in a lot of global north contexts where governments have run out of money. They've obviously privatised local government land holdings, etc. So that's a difficult conversation. I don't think they know what to do in Australia about this. They're actually busily knocking down the few public housing estates they've got and doing interesting, strange things with them, which I don't think is going to really help the affordability issue. So finding mechanisms for local government or national government to own decent tracts of land, which then you can sort of choose to charge a lower rent, for example, is a big challenge, because governments don't have the money to compulsory purchase land now. So, but maybe there are mechanisms for incrementally taking land back off of landowners, property owners who are delinquent landowners, for example, if property is blighted. I think there was the case in Cleveland back in the 1970s where they enacted a law in order to, for local government to be able to take possession of vacant or derelict property if it wasn't being upkept. So that would be a very incremental way of local governments regaining some of that land holding. And the other thing that's worth mentioning as well is I don't think we can talk about affordability without somehow thinking about informal development, self-built housing. again, across the global north, people are taking measures into their own hands, building sheds in the back of London gardens, this kind of thing happens there. In the States, people building off the grid, particularly on the border with Mexico. And here in Santiago, I stayed at our good friend Christian Silva's, I think his family's place out somewhere in the south, in the suburbs. And all the houses there had been built by families incrementally. And quite a large part of housing in Chile seems to have been built in that format. And maybe that should be licensed as well, or incentivized in a way for people to do that and do that incrementally. And that might actually encompass some of the macro campamentos, upgrading of those. So, here we are in Chile. It's a kind of in-between economy. It's sort of, is it global north? Is it kind of parts of it like the global south? It's fundamentally in between, and probably needs to look in both directions, to formal and informal mechanisms.
Yeah, well, exactly related to that, you, Martin, has an extensive work in campamentos, in informality, working with people and communities. 7 years already, 7 years. We started together, so I know. How the extractivist process is related with the formation of these informal settlements? What is your opinion about it? I mean, how you relate this extractivism with informality? How you make the connection as economic geographer in your field?
Well, thank you very much, Francisco, Julia, Julie, and Nick. I think it says a lot about the character of the country or the nation. When you look at what is going on in Antofagasta, which is the capital city of one of the most important mining regions worldwide, and you have no discussion about planning whatsoever. So basically, when you talk about planning, you're talking about one person, one guy who is about to retire, and he's been doing the same thing over and over. So basically, planning is him, and he can tell you that, like, I am planning, like I am the state. So apart from that, planning or thinking in the medium to long term is something really strange. And when you look at the city, it kind of reproduces that thinking, because Antofagasta as a city starts like growing from the port which was used by the Bolivian nation to export silver and some other stuff, but then it started growing informally, and mostly by welcoming a lot of immigration from like the people escaping the World War I, and then World War II, and then Mussolini, and then so on and so forth. So basically, I think it's very related to what we call extractivism, which is a development path or a development strategy. So one could say that Chile as a nation, since it was colonized by the Spanish Empire, it has had this way of thinking about development, which is, let's make a big hole, let's get what is into the hole and send it abroad, and we're just gonna like take a little bit of this wealth, and then we're gonna leave that wealth, that little bit, in the three richest places here in Santiago. So yeah, I think that's the main reason why Antofagasta has this site. I don't know if you've been into Antofagasta, but it's like Chile. It's like a spaghetti-shaped city, so it's stuck between the Cordillera de la Costa, or the hills, and then the sea, the Pacific Ocean. So you have the city at the center, and then you have campamentos all over, like I should say, how to say, borde cerro. I have no idea how to say that in English, like next to the hills. So when I left to do my PhD with all my hope and dreams in 2012, people were saying here in Santiago that campamentos, or the slums, were going to disappear in the next 10 years, I think. So when I left, there were 12 campamentos, and when I came back in 2017, there were 60, and now there are like 80. So something happened there. So yeah, I think these two issues are deeply intertwined, like the lack or the how the central state and then the regional state sees territory as like a treasure to be exploited, which means it means for me that you are acting like a pirate, like let's get this treasure, spend it very fast, and like get wasted and get a lot of entertaining memories, and let's not think about tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be someone else's problem. So that's why I think in my research that that's why we see we are still seeing an exponential growth in campamentos in Antofagasta. We don't see a discussion on planning at any level, not even in terms of academic level, and that also has a very strong side on property, as you have studied, like a lot of the incomes that the miners receive, because the mining jobs are paid way higher wages than the average wage of the Chilean worker. So basically, when they go to strike, they have these bonuses, and they tend to spend those millions of Chilean pesos into property. So again, in Antofagasta, you see on the one hand the informal city growing very fast, and then on the other side you see a lot of new buildings with very tiny flats, 17 square meters, sold as investment opportunities for these mining workers. So I think it's all connected. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's very good. And also,
I-
sorry, Nick, yeah, go on.
Do you want to
you
move
go
on?
on, go
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
I was just going to, thinking as Martin was speaking there, I don't know if this is jumping ahead to the next question, but thinking about the possible alternatives to extractivism. I mean, it was said in some of the interviews that Julie and I did in Western Australia, how would you change things? And this was, I think one of our interviewees had mentioned, well, look, some things are not properly priced in a capitalist global economy, and of course we know what they are. It's carbon. It's becoming better priced. There are carbon offsets and the like, but the proper value of what we're doing when we dig things out of the ground or even build buildings and have embodied carbon in them, we're still properly pricing those, and we're certainly not valuing ecosystem services as well. So that's something which is also imperfectly embodied in things like valuation of land and property. So that's one fundamental thing that probably needs to be, those two aspects are better priced, fully costed, then things might change in a way which is more realistic about what we should be doing with the environment. I think the other thing that Melbourne was a gold rush city, and one of my colleagues, one of his anecdotes in his lectures is that there were tents everywhere. Miners were coming into the port and they were camping where there are now beautiful parks. These were covered with tents before they went off into the hills to do gold mining. And I suppose one thing that occurs to me is another way out of reliance on an economy of extraction. In other words, for cities to escape their bases in nature, would be to think creatively, imaginatively about what migration, informality, macrocampamentos mean, and whether they could be leveraged. I can't remember his name, but I did have a conversation with a gentleman who was involved with Creo Antofagasta, and he kept invoking Shenzhen in China, a special economic zone, okay? Well, if any of you know anything about Shenzhen is now about 12 million population. China has enormous population potential, it's an enormous population, and so he was talking about having a Shenzhen for Antofagasta, like something, and I just said to him, this is not going to work because there's not the population potential. But just listening to what Martin was saying there about obviously people coming to Antofagasta to somehow get involved, there is obviously clearly some population potential there. That's a means for escaping just a very narrowly defined economy, I think, around resource extraction, because those people come with a whole set of skills, that can be useful.
You already answered the next question.
Have I? Okay.
No, I was fine, because actually the next question was about envisioning, on the relationship between this apparently situation in which we are stuck in a moment, especially in Chile, in which we can't think beyond extractivism. There is not a post-extractivist strategy or something like that, a plan for getting out of this model, of development, and how planning can help to envision this another stage of development, if you can put it in that way. What do you think about what tools can we have from planning?
So Julia's right, I have started answering that next question, but maybe just I'll continue in the same vein with the special economic zone idea. It's that scale of special economic zone really isn't going to work in Antofagasta, but it's a really interesting idea, because Julia and I presented also in Caraza at the OECD Mining Regions and Cities Network Conference, and we got asked a sort of similar question about, well, how can we take Caraza from whatever it is, 40,000 population, might even be smaller than that, to something else? And I think I mentioned Julie's supervisor, the late Professor Sir Peter Hall, who came up with the idea of enterprise zones, and he was thinking about Shenzhen, this whole idea of a very liberal context, possibly even neoliberal, where you kind of relax all the rules. There are no rules. You can kind of do what you want. You can come here. One of the key ingredients of his idea was that, and he was thinking about how poor Britain was at the time, but you would allow people to migrate to Britain, suspend all the migration rules. And that's important, because then you do generate population potential. So Caraza could probably have done the same. Australia has very big migration flows. A lot of the big established cities don't really know how to handle these flows. It's a real source of challenge, how to build enough houses quickly enough to house people. And you think, well, why not build another major city and channel all those would-be migrants? Maybe they don't want to go to Caraza, but if you really want to sort of have a major economy that is something outside of purely mining and extraction, maybe there's a way of steering that migration through a place which is going to build out rapidly.
Yeah, well, great. Julie, you prepared and edited this impressive book, Routledge Companion to Creativity and the Built Environment, which is, it's very inspirational. All the chapters here reunited in these ideas, imaginative ideas of how to act in reality to transform and build environment using different tools. It's like impressive tools. So how do you think that this creativity can be used to transform built environment based or depending from extractive economies?
Well, first I want to thank Martin and Francisco for contributing a very exciting chapter in the book, really fill the gap. So I have 3 quick answers to this question. First one is to try to make a community, not just extraction. Second is using creativity and built environment to support sustainable development, not just exploration. Last one is think about develop a diverse economy, going back to what Nick just mentioned about enterprise zones, encouraging other potential options and attract people in, not just aging and dying.
I'll add one further thing onto that list. So again, our interviewees in Australia, if you're going to build a sustainable city, something that's going to last for a long time, who would you start with? You would start with the indigenous population, the people who are there already, not the people who have come in. So in an Australian context, that probably means doing something around land rights and ability for indigenous populations to develop and handing over large swathes of land to let them get on with it, if you like. So I suspect there's some similar element. If you think about the imagination for some of these places, there are people who are deeply connected to those lands, who surely must have ideas about the underlying strengths of those places because they were settled for good reason and probably worth, I was going to say, extracting their knowledge, but that would be the wrong thing to say, I think.
Yeah, well, let's continue that line. I mean, to Martin, maybe jump into this idea of a critical pedagogy, which is something that you are involved with right now, and how to get into these critical pedagogies, searching for these post-extractivist situations of the future, of the possible, as we are discussing now. In your experience, like applying these critical pedagogies with people in the communities, in extractive areas, what are the learnings that you get from that experiences?
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, I would say that there is a larger conversation that, in my humble opinion, we're not having, which is about imagination, about these new possibilities. When I think most of the academic discussion or even discussions about policies, they tend to assume certain things as facts of nature, such as, for example, we live in a capitalist era and there's nothing we can do about it. Whereas on the other hand, we have climate change, we have a genocide taking place right now, people with nuclear weapons anyway. So we tend to keep having the same conversation over and over. And I will say that in this loop, we tend to kill our imagination. And where I found that imagination is in places where people have literally nothing else to do, to lose, because they have literally nothing. So basically, since they have nothing, they can imagine whatever they can imagine is better than their actual situation. So they dare to imagine an informal place where all the mothers, for example, gather and they take care of their children and they create this, I don't know, a cooperative thingy for the kids. And why not the fathers? Because most of the fathers are either dead or somewhere else because of alcoholism and so on and so forth. So basically, that's where I found imagination, very strong imagination. And linking that to your question, in these people, either they, well, most of the time they don't know it, but they actually have critical thinking. So they apply things that we study, coming from the good old man Paulo Freire, and so on and so forth, or Lefebvre. And we use these technical concepts such as the concept of critical thinking or critical pedagogy or learning by service learning, but they, even though they don't know it, they tend to do it anyway. And so basically I would say that critical thinking is the base of all this conversation because it allows you to have a very honest conversation without assumptions or axioms. It's like, this is where we want to be in the next 10 or 17 years or whatever. And I think Arenales, the macro campamento Los Arenales, is a very good example because we met Elizabeth Andrade, who is one of the most important leaders in that macro campamento, and she was very shy, she was just arriving to Chile. She was living a very violent relationship. She was a nun, believe it or not. And then she came here, and 7 years later, she's now the Premio Nacional de Derechos Humanos, or National Awardee of Human Rights, 2022. She has traveled all over the world telling about Los Arenales, and she basically has been she's spearheaded a movement of women who have been able to fight not just one government, but several governments in a very, I would say, the most neoliberal state, which is not afraid to use its full force in order to repress these people, like by the police or using the police, beating them into submission, so on and so forth. And last Saturday, they were signing the eradication project, meaning that they finally got the funding in order to build their houses. Whereas 3 years ago, 5 years ago, this was completely impossible. Why? Because they didn't own the land, because they were immigrants, most of them are immigrants, because they didn't know, I don't know, the very technical things of architecture or planning and so on and so forth. So right now they made this possible. So I think, critical thinking or critical pedagogy is crucial in this conversation. And also, if you take another step backwards, I would say that it's also very important to really incorporate other ideologies into the discussion, because we have the liberal point of view, the neoliberal, I don't know, whatever you want, even the Christian point of view. But when you look at some of these examples who are very successful until they are violently repressed, these seem, or they have very anarchic features, which are also present in planning literature, which is something I had no idea. Nick told me about that. So that's why I think all these conversations come together. Like planning, at least for me, is more than a discipline. It's a conversation to be had, and it's more enriching when you don't have these assumptions. And in order to don't have these assumptions, probably you need more or better critical thinking skills. Some people have it, some other people not, but I think our role as academics and policy makers can actually be in that very specific part of the chain, like in enhancing those critical thinking skills.
That's great. I mean, I don't know if you want to complement something about it.
I mean, maybe we've also gone backwards as well in certain respects in terms of what Marty is saying, because if you went back to the 60s and 70s in Britain, you did have these sort of community projects where academics would work with community workers, local government workers, and citizens. There was a series of projects in the UK that were based on the sort of model that Martin's describing, and they actually were quite formative in producing new academic ideas. I think some of the academics that got involved were quite celebrated for being innovative in theoretical terms. So they can be, not just practically useful, but also, produce returns back to the academic community. So there are many things tried in the 60s and 70s within varieties of capitalist economies. For example, taking planning on buses and architecture on buses, the Polyarch tour and the interactions mobile bus that took planning to communities. So literally taking sort of exhibitions and academics out from the university to various communities. So lots of ideas were tried, I think, and it's a bit sad that, probably we're actually, if you think about the world today, I mean, I don't know whether planning's to blame here, but we're certainly more constrained by regulations, rules. Think about trying to do this. If you wanted to do it in a university sector, in our university, it might take you 5 years to get permission to do this, and a whole load of that much paperwork. Gone are the days when you could just take the students out of the classroom, do something really interesting. It's now so bureaucratized and risk managed that all those risks in producing knowledge, both in the academic interest but also people's interests, it's really hard to do that now, and I think we've gone backwards in that respect.
Well, I think we have to start to wrap up all the conversation. I have a final provocation that I would like to have from you, which is related in a way with imagination, neoliberalism, and creativity as well, and the world in which we live now, and all the struggles that are happening at the same time, simultaneously. This is a phrase that has been attributed to Frederick Jameson, Mark Fisher, and Zizek. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than a modest change in capitalism. What are the reactions to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's probably, I once saw David Harvey give a talk. Apologies, David, if you actually watch this, I doubt it, but after a long, erudite talk of an hour, a student who was very enamoured with David Harvey, rather gushingly said, David, that was marvellous, but what should we do? How? And yeah. David just can't, he must have had this question 100 times at least. He said, my job is not to tell you what to do, it's to analyse things. Which I thought was a bit of a cop-out, because, it's basically saying, come the revolution, that will change things. Look, I think we had examples of what was done. I mentioned some of them already in the 60s and 70s in Britain, you know, of interesting things that were done to provoke imagination within a more incremental fashion, let's say, within the existing system. And we can talk about this afterwards, but there's lots of really interesting, innovative things that we could go back to. Somebody once described that era in Britain as the moment of last futures, when we stopped, at that moment we stopped dreaming about the future. So, we've had some of those examples. We can probably go back to some of them, I think, as well. So, I don't think hope's lost. We've got some good historical cues. I'm rambling a bit now. I'll hand over to Julie or Martin.
Okay. So I just have two more points to say before my daughter getting very edgy. First of all, I think it's important to articulate the value of being imaginative and try to get buy-in from wide stakeholders. And the last point I want to make is to believe in a better future and never give up.
Yeah, I will just say that we have had this discussion with Francisco several times, and with Felipe Encinas, who's also a colleague over there. It's like this tension between nihilism and hope. And I think after a lot of years spent in that nihilistic trench, I think that hope as a political stance is very important in order to have this conversation, especially when things don't go the way you like. These countries are a very good example of that, Argentina too, and some other countries. But I think it's very important because it's very easy to be imaginative when everything is trendy, or when it's trendy to have imagination or to be inclusive. But when it's not trendy and it's actually punished, I think it leads to a stronger political conviction, which also means that you're taking that conversation seriously. It's not something you're talking because everyone else is talking about it, but if you dare to imagine like the eradication of an informal settlement and the most neoliberal country, is because you know that your neighbors support you, you know that, you believe in your principles, so there are bigger things acting rather than like the little things which usually lead you to immediacy, like not thinking about the future. So I would say, again, quoting the good old Paulo Freire, that hope is crucial, or the good old Lefebvre, concrete utopias. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys for being here, for this engaging discussion, this optimistic also at the end conversation about imagination, about planning, about several issues of communities, of critical pedagogies, and thank you to be here. We have a lot of activities, a lot of things to do yet together, so thank you. A final clap for you.